a grander universe for God to have created and for astronomers and musicians to play in, I suppose.
In 1792, Haydn's first British visit came to an end, and he returned home to Austria for just over a year. The son of a rural wheelwright, Haydn had trained as a choir boy at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. In his 20s, he'd gone into service with the Esterházy family in the small town of Eisenstadt, 30 miles southeast of Vienna. The magnificent Esterházy Palace was to prove the perfect laboratory for the young composer's extraordinary talents.
So, Walter, am I imagining Haydn walking to work along this corridor every day?
He did, yeah. He wasn't living in the palace, but this was his workshop. So to be there twice a day, speaking with the prince to get the wishes from him, what kind of music he wants to hear or what he has to prepare.
Yeah.
And then he rehearsed here with the musicians.
He's rehearsing in this room?
In this room and maybe rooms next to this,
right.
So...
Oh, my goodness. Oh, this is some adventure playground. Unbelievable.
Yeah. I always say this is Haydn's Graceland.
Yeah. And you can hear, the most beautiful acoustic.
It wasn't like this, the acoustic, because the wood wasn't here.
Okay.
When he came in here, so he found this place, yeah? Wonderful hall, big hall.
With a marble floor, though?
With the marble floor, and this is not so good for acoustic conditions. So he asked the prince to put logs, wood on it, so that it's better for it. And now we find even the bills of the carpenters who did this in 1761. So Haydn asked for conditions to have the perfect situation. Like I said, it was a workshop for him. So you said, wow, when you came in here, yeah? So maybe Haydn did this as well, and he had to compose symphonies for the prince. There were no symphonies before, so Haydn came here, and we have this famous number 6, 7, and 8 now, symphony, the
Matin, midi, soir.
Morning, lunchtime, and the evening. And look up on the ceiling. That's what it is. We have l'Aurora, the goddess of sunrise, on the carriage. And yeah, we have here La Luna. And it's the evening, yeah? The evening goddess. And in the middle, this marriage on the Olympus. But it's noon.
God, that is incredible.
So, morning, noon, evening. Number 6, 7, and 8 now.
So the man himself is in here, he looks up at his pictures, how practical. Right, I'll write a piece of music about that one, then that one, and that one.
And in every movement, there are solo parts into it for his musicians. So
he's playing to the strengths of the particular hot musicians within the orchestra.
Yeah. So this was also very clever, because what did he do? He showed to the prince, you engaged perfect musicians. Look how wise you did. And to the musicians, he showed, I look after you, that you have perfect music to play, to show off in front of the prince, to show off what you really can do. And so, yeah, and this developed.
Prince Nicholas of Esterházy could trust Haydn to keep him at the cutting edge of symphonic invention, but he also had a rather touching passion for an unusual and archaic instrument.
What is this wonderful instrument?
Well, it's called a baritone. It has 6 or sometimes 7 strings like this one, and they're tuned a little bit like a guitar or a lute. It's not easy to play. I mean, okay, if you play viol, there's one thing, but this thing...
Now, hang on a minute. This is a whole other set of strings behind the set of strings you were showing us.
Yes, and that can create problems. I mean, you have to work on that.
So you're playing with the thumb of your left hand on the strings at the back?
I plug them.
Oh, talk about multitasking.
That's it. And that's the problem about it. So you can accompany yourself in the worst case. For example, like this. And that's what makes the sound special, but what makes it a little hard to play. So there's not too many people trying to do that.
You know, had the Prince not played the baritone, do you think Haydn would have written nearly so much music for the instrument?
I'm sure he wouldn't have written anything, because even in those times it was a very special instrument.
After just a few years at Esterházy, Prince Nicholas rewarded him with the post of head of music, and Haydn was able to buy his first house just down the road from the palace.
This is his house where he lived. So, and he worked from here, and we have this little thing here.
Is that his piano?
Yeah, his forte piano. Anton Walter built this from Vienna, was very famous at this time. I always say, please don't touch. Yeah. But
being as I'm with you, what do you think?
I think we can manage this. So
fantastic.
Maybe you try. Have a try.
Wow. Beautiful, delicate little sound, just as you'd expect. They're such little perfect instruments, these Viennese forte pianos. This is a Walter, and I think I'm right in saying Mozart had a Walter as well.
Yeah, in his birthplace in Salzburg, they have a forte piano. They thought it's an Anton Walter. And when this was restored, they found out it's from the same piece of wood.
No.
So they're brothers.
That is ridiculous.
And Haydn and Mozart are friends.
These two great masters, Haydn and Mozart, both own forte pianos, which are drawn from the same tree. That is quite remarkable.
A good coincidence, I think. Look at this picture, yeah? So
now that is the famous image of Haydn, isn't it?
A younger man, yeah.
Yeah.
He's on his forte piano composing.
He's got a very kind face. Do you agree with that?
He himself said, I'm not a handsome man, but women loved me anyway. But he was good-humored, and I'm sure you could see this in his face, that he loved to talk with people, that he was in peace with himself. And I think this is very important to understand also his music. He struggled, of course, like everyone struggles in his life. And you can hear it in his music sometimes, but it always ends in peace and with hope. It's always a bright future at the end.
Well, it's a very interesting thing, because if you think about any piece of his music, of course it will have moments of melancholy, it will have moments of sheer high spirits, and lots of other things in between. But it never quite goes to that dark place that Mozart, say, does, where it's like he's gouging your soul out.
He is more grounded, I think so. Where he lived, he knew he has a place in life. Maybe Mozart traveled too much as a young boy. Didn't he have a home? Haydn had a home, and he had this region here. Of course, it wasn't so easy for him, but I think this is very important to understand. He wasn't torn apart.
In 1794, Haydn came to Britain for a second time with a visit that proved to be every bit as triumphant as the first, and again lasting about 18 months. Widespread public affection for Haydn hadn't diminished, especially amongst the ladies. Haydn, whose wife stayed home in Austria during these visits, once said that he couldn't understand how he'd been loved by so many pretty women, claiming they can't have been drawn by my beauty. Probably the most significant relationship Haydn had during his time in London was with the widow of the former master of the King's Music, herself a pianist, Rebecca Schroeter. Haydn later told his biographer that he would have married her very easily had I been free at the time.
Perhaps some of the youthful energy of this liaison with Rebecca Schroeter is reflected in the three great piano trios that Haydn completed on this second London visit and dedicated to her. For me, it was fascinating to find evidence of Mrs. Schroeter's intimacy with the older composer, her signature on a contract that Haydn made with the London publisher at the end of his second visit, now housed in the British Library.
Simon, it looks, well, highly legal.
Well, indeed, it was a legal document, but I think it was gives us an idea of how Haydn was engaged with the commercial world in London. So what we've got here is an agreement with the publisher Hyde, and it's quite a long shopping list, actually. If you have a look at what he indicated he might write, symphonies, quartets, piano sonatas, piano trios, English songs, Italian songs, catches and glees, the whole range of different genres that might have been available at the time. And one of the things which is really interesting about this catalogue is that we've got here 3 grand symphonies, £100.
A lot of money.
That's a lot of money. But then you look over here and we've got 3 piano trios, as we would now call them. Much smaller scale pieces, easier and quicker to compose, £75.
So what we're talking about is the domestic music market, aren't we? Which I guess is a burgeoning thing here, the idea that your front room became your own little private concert hall.
Absolutely, and of course, we should bear in mind from the point of view of the publisher that if you sold a set of parts for symphonies, how many people across the country were going to be able to buy those parts and put on these symphonies? What really made the money was the music for the drawing room, and that was typically the piano music that was played by women, by the daughters of the household. It was an accomplishment that might lead you to the perfect husband, one might say. We see that, of course, in the novels of Jane Austen, for example. Or, on the other hand, songs. Very astute of Hyde to include some English songs in the list of pieces that he hoped Haydn might produce.
But also, presumably, rather astute of Haydn. Haydn could see here was a gaping need, and he's writing all these canzonettas, presumably with an eye on the money he was going to make.
Well, absolutely, and here we are again, if we just have a look at this here. 6 English songs with accompaniment for pianoforte, £75 again.
That's a remarkable amount of money to pay. This must have been amazing for Haydn, who'd been pretty much indentured all of his adult life, his professional life, to be coming and to be doing deals with a publisher in London which were going to get him untold sums of money.
Well, Haydn, I must say, was a very acute businessman in that sense, almost too acute. He did tend to sell things several times around Europe. They didn't have the same copyright, ideas that we have nowadays.
So you mean you could sell one piece to different people for different sums of money all at the same time?
As long as it was in a different country, that was kind of all right.
Follow, follow, follow me. Follow, follow, follow me.
In Britain and the rest of Europe, one of the great love affairs of the time was with all things Scottish. Here, Haydn cannily spotted another rich seam to mine and was easily persuaded to start work on commercial arrangements of Scottish folk song for the domestic market.
To what extent was this, well, Haydn's very vigorous publication of all these so-called Scottish folk songs, to what extent was it building this sense of the mythology of the north of Britain?
Oh, I think hugely. And of course, Haydn's just one of a whole handful of European composers who do this kind of job. A lot of publications appear in Scotland with local, much less well-known musicians doing arrangements. And then towards the end of the 18th century, Haydn does some arrangements for a London publisher, and then George Thomson appears on the scene, and he's the big daddy of this process. And to be honest, I don't know that either of them at that particular point realised how big a project this would end up being.
Would Haydn have actually heard authentic Scottish folk song and music?
Highly unlikely, I think, is the answer. I mean, Haydn sadly doesn't come north of the border, unlike some of the other composers who do set Scottish songs. But he does experience performances in London, and Scotch songs, as they're termed at that time, are really popular from the early 18th century. And they're popular on a really popular level, so they're performed at Vauxhall Gardens, they're performed in cantatas on the concert platform. But more importantly, a lot of these publications are created for domestic performance.
Should all the quanterns be forgot and never brought to mind? Should all the quanterns be forgot and auld lang syne? For auld lang syne, my dear, for auld lang syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for auld lang syne.
Auld Lang Syne is a very old tradition in Scotland as a song of parting, frequently sung at social events. Of course, the one that we sing and the one that we constantly refer to is the version that Robert Burns wrote.
We twa here in a boat, the praise and put the gow hands fine.
Auld Lang Syne was just one of a staggering 400 Scottish folk songs that Haydn arranged to meet the positively insatiable public demand of the time.
Nowadays, I think a lot of people feel very negative about them. You know, what was Thomson doing asking Haydn to touch these melodies that he knew nothing about? How dare he? But at the time, I think what Thomson was doing, you know, was made perfect sense to him. You know, he was inspired by new European music and he loved his national music and he wanted to bring the two together.
Both Haydn's extended visits to Britain had been successes beyond his wildest dreams. Our streets really had been paved with gold for him. But the frenetic pace of London was eventually too much for the elderly composer, and in 1795 Haydn made a final parting. Now he wanted time to crystallise the ideas and experiences of these 4 years in some of his greatest late works.
Haydn spent the last 14 years of his life in Austria, riding high off the back of his successes in Britain, not least the money he'd made, which allowed him, amongst other things, to build this luxurious house on the outskirts of Vienna. But something that had really inspired Haydn about his time in Britain was their expression of nationhood through a single song. Britain was the first country to have a national anthem, and Haydn thought to himself, Austria needs one of these too. So he wrote one.
God protect Emperor Franz. 2 years after leaving Britain, the master of form and structure also proved he could write an iconic tune. a melody which managed to survive not only the collapse of the Austrian monarchy in 1918, but even its appropriation by the Nazis. But the wealthy international celebrity didn't break his bonds with his employers at Esterházy.
Okay, so Haydn comes back from his great victorious successes in London. How's he now perceived?
He came back as the most famous composer of his time, so he got world fame, and he came back to this remote little town of Eisenstadt, and he had a new prince, the fourth Prince Esterházy. Because he was so famous, they wanted to keep him. They wanted to connect his name to the Esterházy family.
It's like having the crown jewels in your house, isn't it? Everyone's going to want to come and see.
Exactly. That was Haydn. Famous, and so the Esterházys were famous. And he had only composed one piece per year for the Esterházys.
Just one piece?
Just one piece. And
because in the past he'd composed so much, all the time, for the Esterházys.
For that, yeah, but this, he still got money, so he had so much freedom. He had an income from them, he had a pension from them. It was like a life insurance.
Tell me about the Nelson visit.
It was 1800. Lord Nelson and Emma, Lady Hamilton, they came from Italy on the way back to London. It was a long way back home, and in Vienna they were there for a longer period. They were famous too, most famous couple. Yeah. And the Esterházy, Prince Esterházy, of course, wanted to have him in his castle, in his palace, because most famous person in his palace. Lord Nelson only came when the Prince Esterházy guaranteed that Haydn will be here, because Lady Emma Hamilton wanted to sing with Haydn. The story goes that the prince was a little bit annoyed because Lady Hamilton was all the time with Haydn, and Lord Nelson was always playing cards. But they performed here the Mass Haydn composed 2 years before, which is now the name has Nelson Mass.
Oh God, my appetite's completely better now. I've got to have a little go on this little peach of an organ, the organ that Haydn knew and played himself. A lot of men in Britain either have or would like to have a garden shed. It is a great British tradition, but not exclusively so. This is Haydn's garden shed on what were the outskirts of the 18th century Eisenstadt, a place where I imagine he could come for sheer peace and quiet, for repose, perhaps to spend time tending the garden, perhaps potting some seedlings, but just quietly to think and to open his mind. And it's in one of his last great works, The Creation, that we get a real glimpse into Haydn's inner world. For me, that utterly ravishing sunrise that lies at the heart of Haydn's creation reveals a man who discovered, whilst in Britain, what it is to really look at the heavens. And it's fascinating to compare it with that far slenderer sunrise composed so many years before, when the brilliant young man arrived at Esterhazy and merely gazed at a painted ceiling. Although it was composed in Austria, I always think of the creation as a British work. It's based on an English text, but most importantly, it's an oratorio, that great British form developed by Handel for and with the British. But ultimately, I think it sums up Haydn's time here and his delight at completing the circle where art, science, and faith meet.
In the early morning of the 31st of May 1809, surrounded by friends, Haydn died peacefully at his home in Vienna. But Haydn's influence on our musical landscape extended far beyond any individual work. Like Handel before him, he seized the opportunities our nation offered. Big symphonies for increasingly popular public concerts, choral works to draw people together, music inspired by folk song, music for the home. Working and developing alongside us, Haydn left Britain a richer musical nation. Next week, in the final episode of The Birth of British Music, we'll see how Felix Mendelssohn redefined the power of music for a Victorian world.